Everyone. Unblocked is a bi-monthly event series where guests are asked questions in an AMA-style format, focusing on questions relevant to early-stage startups and blockchain technology. Unblocked is sponsored by DLab, a startup accelerator and venture studio that sits within the SOSV family. You can find out more at www.dlab.vc. We hope you enjoy the conversation. It's my pleasure to introduce my guest today, Muneeb Ali. He's the founder of Blockstack and the CEO of Hero. Muneeb, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great. It's great to have you here. I'm super excited to learn more about Blockstack and all the new things that are happening. But I think a great place to start would be sort of the origin story around Stacks. How did it come about, and what made you think like, wow, this needs to happen, and I'm going to devote, the next however past years it's been 5-10 years to building this and bringing it to market.
Yeah, so I think I was doing my PhD at Princeton University. So ever since I was, I think, an undergrad, I've been really interested in computer networking research. So I don't know how I got interested in it, but that's the specific area within computer science that just really attracted me. Like I started programming, even before my undergrad, just messing around with Linux and shell scripts on my computer. But I definitely remember like reading a book by Larry Peterson, who's actually a Princeton professor, and I got to work with him later on. And that was kind of like my beginning into the world of computer networking. And I think I just knew like very quickly that this is where I want to do research work. And it was a bit rare for an undergrad to be publishing papers actually, and that too, especially from Pakistan, right? Like where there isn't a established like research culture and so on. So I just went kind of like deep on the computer networking, distributed systems research world for almost like 10 years. And I think it was actually during that time that I came across multiple, I would say, internet protocols. Some of them are designed as here's a clean slate internet design project or something, right? Where all the I think the academic researchers, they're well aware of the shortcomings of the existing protocols, and they would write research papers about it. They would build some prototypes, but nothing would ever get commercialized and really impact the real internet, right? And which was something that I think deeply bothered me in many ways. And that combined with I felt that a lot of the kind of like academia, at least in the field I was in, which was like it's like very practical, like people were building data centers and cloud computing, and those types of things. It felt like it's a little bit it's better to be in the industry and work on the real problems versus being in a bubble in academia. And also sometimes the resources would be an issue, even at really kind of like top research institutions like Princeton. I remember writing research grants to the NSF, where even if the NSF would give you the award, it would be like $400,000, and then 60% of it is the university overhead. And you compare that to startup fundraising, and you can raise a lot more capital a lot faster, and then you're directly in control of the capital. Right? So I think that was kind of like the trigger to decide that I want to pursue some of this, but in a different way, right? Like let's go out to Silicon Valley and raise venture capital for effectively hardcore computer science R&D, right? And I think that was the twist, and I think that's the thing that where you would actually lose a lot of VCs, like who wouldn't want to take that risk on funding effectively an R&D lab. But I think we were very grateful that we got investors like Union Square Ventures or Naval Ravikant or Y Combinator, where they were clearly kind of like, this is R&D work. Like this is it's like a moonshot, but very small chances of a very large success. But it's not a traditional business. Like there's no business model. This is open source code. This is decentralized protocols, and we were very upfront about what we were doing. And I think we are very grateful that these people kind of like took a bet way back before anything was even real, and it was mostly just R&D.
Yeah. So I guess when was this? How long ago was this?
So this is 2013, and I was supposed to graduate from Princeton in 2013, right? So I was working on my thesis, and I pretty much I I took a leave from the university, and my original thesis that was like half baked and not fully done was supposed to be my backup. That we're going to go out, try to raise capital. I met my co-founder at Princeton as well, and one of the professors, JP, he was kind of like advising us and helping us navigate the startup world. And the idea was that, hey, if we are unable to raise money, or if this thing doesn't go anywhere, I'll come back, because I was on leave as a PhD candidate from the university, and I'll finish my thesis and kind of like go on with my the career route that is the default one for a PhD candidate. And I think one thing led to another, and I kept asking for more and more leave from the university. And in the end, interestingly, we ended up publishing a lot of the research work that we were doing at the startup, and that became a new thesis for me, right? So because we published papers, we went back to the university and said, look, I was able to publish this work at some of the top conferences. Like it has nothing to do with what I was working on earlier, but this is like peer reviewed and published at conferences. Do you think it's good enough for a thesis? And they said, actually, yes. If you want to write a thesis on this, you can. And they were very supportive. So my thesis actually ended up being on Blockstack, and I officially got it done in 2017. So there was a 4-year leave from the university. And interestingly, like I think in many ways, like my thesis ended up being a lot more relevant and a lot more exciting versus whatever cloud computing type of a thing I would have done otherwise.
So when you were raising money in 2013, was it just purely like, did you have any concepts of Blockstack at all? Like you wanted to build a smart contract platform on Bitcoin, or was it more just like, as you said, like just purely we're going to do some R&D here and see what we can come up with?
So I think we were, so me and my co-founder Ryan, we were looking at effectively fundamental problems on the internet, right? So the lens was that we want to kind of like build a better internet. Like that was the underlying theme. And here are so many things that are broken at the internet protocol level. And those are like well understood problems. Like, a lot of people don't think about it, but those are clearly identified in the research circles, that here's the problem with kind of like the underlying internet infrastructure. And most of the founding fathers of the internet, in which we are very grateful that most of them are still alive, right? Like, so Vint Cerf, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, David Clark, who was the chief protocol architect, he's an MIT researcher. All of them actually agree on what the broken things are on the internet protocol layer, and what a more user-owned, decentralized internet should look like, right? And interestingly, we were kind of like the crazy ones who said, like, why don't we take a stab at it? Like, how would you build it, right? And the initial versions of it, I remember, actually didn't have any blockchains in it, right? So we were trying to solve the problem, and we were frankly like not even aware of blockchains at that time. This is 2013. Like, yes, I've heard of Bitcoin. There were some reading groups that I was invited to, and so on, but we clearly didn't connect the dots. And we were effectively, like look at the domain name system, for example. It's like a federated network. It's fairly decentralized, not fully decentralized, but fairly decentralized. It kind of does its job, which is very different from look at, Facebook login, for example, where it's clearly controlled by a single company, right? So you could design much better protocols than the ones that are being used today on a day-to-day basis without blockchains as well. But blockchains actually help you. They're a very elegant solution for some of the problems we are trying to solve. And they actually kind of like help you go more on the decentralized open side on the spectrum, right? So instead of building like a federated network or a peer-to-peer network that, it's kind of like more complex in many ways, it's actually easier that if there is a well-functioning blockchain, a lot of the technical problems actually get solved by the underlying network. And I think that was the aha moment in 2013. And it was interestingly, we were working on these ideas while just getting pulled into crypto, or very organically, right? Like, so Bitcoin was like $90 at that time, and a lot of our friends would basically be like, you seem so excited in crypto. Why don't you do something in this space? And it just happened, right? Like you were able to put 2 and 2 together. that these blockchains are actually a very elegant way of solving these problems. And then we weren't the only one. Like if you look at the crypto industry now, there would be 5+ well-funded projects with sophisticated teams who are all coming to the same realization that Web3 or this next generation internet would actually be built using blockchains. And I think where we differentiate is that we did consider the design that I remember this discussion like 2013, late 2013, that okay, so blockchains are going to play a fundamental role in a future internet, but then the question naturally becomes like which blockchain, right? Do you build it on Bitcoin? Do you build it on some fork of Bitcoin? So I don't know if people know this, but Namecoin used to be the second largest cryptocurrency at one point. It's a fork of Bitcoin. It added some more functionality. Like effectively, I think NFTs are kind of like all the craze these days, but NFTs are effectively non-fungible tokens. And I would actually say that Namecoin deserves credit for original NFTs, because really what it did was it took Bitcoin, forked it, and introduced the concept of a non-fungible token, which was a domain name, right? So a domain name is not fungible. Like my domain name is different from your domain, and you can sell these things. And then there can be other types of non-fungible tokens as well. And so we looked at Namecoin in 2013, which was like, that project was like barely alive. Right? It's an open source project, and not a lot of people were working on it, and there were some security problems with it and so on. And the third option was, should we go off and build our own blockchain? Right? And I think the build your own blockchain is the approach that Vitalik picked with Ethereum, and building on. Initially, we actually experimented with Namecoin for a little bit, but what attracted us there was also the connection to Bitcoin. It had this like merge mining type of a thing going on with Bitcoin. But we quickly discovered that that's not the right design. But we were always in the camp of like, let's do it on Bitcoin. And that is true till now, right? Like I think the fundamental difference between Stacks and Ethereum or some other project would be we're trying to do this on Bitcoin versus they're building separate blockchains and separate networks. And then there are technical differences that we can get.
Yeah. So I guess, my next question, of course, is going to be, do you think that, being built on the Bitcoin consensus or built Bitcoin blockchain is your main differentiator? I guess if you could, of course, Bitcoin's proof of work, you have your own sort of consensus mechanism. It's called proof of transfer. And would just be curious to hear what is proof of transfer? How does it work and interact with proof of work or the consensus layer of Bitcoin?
Yes. So I think let me first explain the problem we're trying to solve, right? So the problem we're trying to solve is that we believe in the network effects of Bitcoin. We actually think that Bitcoin is a store of value, whereas for a smart contract platform, the asset that is being used is actually gas for smart contracts. Okay? So, which is very different from a store of value. Like you don't want to use gas for smart contracts as a store of value, and a lot of people confuse that. And interestingly, the problem we're trying to solve is that we don't want to build a separate network where that does not benefit from the security of Bitcoin. Like we think that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, like Bitcoin is actually, it's entirely possible that Bitcoin keeps becoming more and more secure and bigger and bigger, both as a brand and a community, but also the network itself, right? So we kind of like want to ride on top of that security and that momentum that Bitcoin has, and we are not competing with it, right? But what that means is that you actually now need to design a blockchain that either is like kind of like directly on Bitcoin, like literally, like every transaction is a Bitcoin transaction. And that's what some of our earlier versions actually looked like. Or you somehow can connect to Bitcoin, where you're settling all of the different transactions in Bitcoin, but you can scale independently of Bitcoin. Right? So in some ways, building a separate network is actually easier because you are in control of the code base. You're basically writing a full-fledged separate system. But over here, you want to connect with something that cannot change. Bitcoin is also like you can't change it, right? Like that's why it's valuable. So even if you want a single opcode in Bitcoin, like like good luck, right? Like it's not going to happen. So you have to design your system in a way that can work without changing Bitcoin, and you almost have this consensus layer between Bitcoin and your blockchain. So that's the problem we solved with the proof of transfer consensus, which is basically a consensus layer between two different blockchains, Stacks and Bitcoin. And mining basically happens on the Bitcoin side, and the smart contracts are on the Stack side, and they scale that way, right? So connecting this back to kind of like Ethereum or the designs we saw like way back in 2013. I remember seeing the Ethereum paper before it was published, right? Someone forwarded me an email and it was an Ethereum paper. And I think like coming from distributed systems, like there were two kind of like big no-nos for me in that design. And interestingly, that remains true till now. Like they are the same two differences that Stacks has, other than kind of like being built on Bitcoin. So let's go over them. So the first difference is Ethereum has its own proof of work, meaning that it has a separate network. So miners are doing proof of work, and Bitcoin miners are also doing proof of work. But that, and if you look at kind of like the early writings of Satoshi Nakamoto as well, like he actually envisioned a lot of these use cases that people would build domain names or other types of use cases around blockchain, and he wanted those use cases to share the compute power of Bitcoin, right? So pretty much like in the design camp like we are, but it actually like it took me a lot of time to realize the implications on communities on this. Like if you share your compute power with Bitcoin, you're actually kind of like part of the Bitcoin community, and you want Bitcoin to survive because you're dependent on it, right? But if you start a separate proof of work network, like you're fragmented the community at that point, and there's a little bit of a tension and a war or a tribal culture that starts that we've actually seen happen, right? Because now you're actually fighting over the resources. There's the miner that is mining on Ethereum is not mining on Bitcoin. Like they don't share anything. So you're actually fighting over scarce resources. You're kind of like rebuilding the underlying layers. And then people start asking the question that, hey, is Ethereum going to become money at some point, or is Bitcoin going to be the reserve currency and so on? And then there's that clash, which in some ways, like in my mind, in a parallel universe, you could have avoided if Ethereum was actually built on top of Bitcoin. Right? And so that's one thing. The other two things are, one is the approach to scalability. So Ethereum has, without getting into too much details, this general idea of a lot of scalability at the base layer, right? So a lot of complexity is at the base layer. Even with ETH2, like if you look at sharding type of designs, they're trying to embrace a lot of data and a lot of complexity at the base layer, that we will be able to scale all of this at the base layer, right? So initially the vision was like a world computer that can store a lot of data, that can process a lot of transactions at the base layer, and they continue to do that. And it's basically whenever people complain about like high gas fees, or whenever in 2017 when CryptoKitties couldn't scale beyond like 1 million or so users, like those things, like you could just look at paper designs and you should be able to predict that yes, this thing is not going to scale beyond like 1 million users on any applications, or if there's a lot of load, the network will clog down, right? It's kind of like designed to work at small scale, but not designed to work at large scale. And we're in the design school where we think that you should do as little as possible at the blockchain layer, which is actually what Bitcoin also does. Right? Like there's a reason why Bitcoin doesn't have smart contracts. There's a reason why they disable certain opcodes and so on. So we actually want to keep the blockchain layer one as small and minimal as possible. So in some ways, it's the inverse of Ethereum, right? Like we are on purpose pushing out functionality and logic, and we're scaling the basically on top. Like instead of like trying to scale the base layer, like with sharding and other types of, like you can even picture it that instead of scaling that way, you're kind of like scaling on top. Like we are pushing complexity outside of the blockchain and then doing it that way. And the third point would be the choice of the programming language. Ethereum went for a Turing complete JavaScript-like programming language, and which is something that again, like it just naturally happened that we are in a different kind of like technical school of thought. we actually think the Turing complete languages are probably like the absolute worst thing you could do for writing smart contracts, because the only thing that matters there is security. So being able to, because the first time that you can actually keep money on a computer program, and that money can be lost, right? So the only thing that really matters is that can you have formal verifications for this program? How secure is my program? Like, are there built-in features that help me with the security of the program? Like, everything else basically doesn't matter. You're not optimizing for speed. You're not optimizing for something else. You're basically, I would say, uh, you're maybe not even optimizing for ease of programming, right? Like, what you're really optimizing is just security. If you have to pick one thing, it has to be security. Like, this is the kind of code that runs on an airplane, for example. Like, the airplane cannot crash. You need to have formal verifications that this code is not going to make the airplane crash. And I think that's very different from a JavaScript website that can crash and come back and lose data and do this and that. So I think those are kind of like the main differences. That what's the programming language? Is it a kind of like a decidable language with formal proofs versus a Turing complete language? Or what's the scalability model? Like, are you kind of like scaling at the base layer, or do you view the base layer as a very minimal thing? And the third is like, is this on Bitcoin versus is this a separate block? So those are the three, I think, differences.
I guess, how would, I mean, in also in some regards, you kind of helped solve that kind of classic problem that a lot of early stage startups face when they're trying to build a platform. How do you got to get both sides of the marketplace, right? And it seems pretty logical. It's like, well, we could just use Bitcoin and just take anyone who has Bitcoin, right? There's already a user base there and community. Whereas with all these other blockchains outside of Ethereum, there's new ones coming up all the time. You have to build that community from scratch essentially. And now you have to be like, well, is it better than Ethereum, or is it better than Bitcoin? Is it better than whatever it is? So I guess, if you extrapolate, let's just say Stack is immensely successful, large part of the world is using it. How does that affect Bitcoin? Like, does that have any influence with how updates are being made on the Bitcoin blockchain? How does it change anything structurally? I'm just curious if you've thought about, what happens if 50% of the world's using Blockstack or whatever it may be.
Yeah. So I think the way to think about this is that our thesis with stacks, and let me actually explain something as well. So when we were starting the project was called Blockstack, and the company was called Blockstack as well. So you can imagine how that's confusing. So Blockstack was structured as a public benefit corporation, so it's Blockstack PBC and Blockstack the project. And one thing we did last year was we wanted to clearly separate our company from the project. So we simplified the project to Stacks. Stacks is the project and the open source kind of like network and blockchain and the cryptocurrency. And our company is Hero, which was doing the R&D for the public infrastructure. But now, after the launch of our main network, the Stacks 2 that launched in January, we basically now build the developer tools for the network. And now there are many other entities in the ecosystem as well. So we're not the kind of like the only player in this ecosystem. So coming back to like, hey, what if Stacks is successful? I think the thesis here is that I think we'll see a lot of experimentation in this space. So you mentioned that a lot of other blockchains are coming out. I think we'll see that, even if application-specific blockchains, right? Hey, maybe here's a blockchain for NFTs. Here's a blockchain for optimized for something else. And I think our thesis, which might sound crazy, right, is things that actually show legs and show traction, they will eventually get implemented on top of Bitcoin, right? So it's a little bit like embrace all the experimentation. Like, it's amazing that maybe thousands of apps got built on top of Ethereum, but the top 3 use cases that are emerging, they're like baskets of use cases, right? Like, there are some sort of AMMs, there are some stable coins, there are some liquidity protocols. Like, it's actually fairly relatively simple to build those things once they have found product market fit, right? And you're bringing them to a network that is just bigger. Like, for example, if Ethereum has $200 billion of kind of capital available at the maximum size, Bitcoin has $1 trillion, right? So if you bring a AMM to Bitcoin, it might actually get more liquidity on Bitcoin if you implement it properly, right? So that's kind of like the thesis. Or take NFTs for example, right? NFTs are taking off, that's great, but in the long term, what is the value of the NFT, right? It's basically ownership, strong ownership, and provenance that you can track. Like, is this the right owner? And then, well, if you look at Bitcoin, if you're settling that information in Bitcoin, Bitcoin is not going away, right? Like, you don't want your NFT to live on a blockchain that might not be around 5 years from now, right? So that's kind of like the core thesis. And then obviously there are technical details that kind of the scale on Bitcoin, can the smart contracts actually work? And we have kind of like proven, for example, like the main blockchain launched in January, and there's a smart contract on it called the POX contract, where people are locking up their capital in sacks to earn Bitcoin, right? And it went to 100 million, I think within a couple of weeks of launch. Then it went to 200 million, then 300, 400. I believe it's north of $500 million locked within 8 to 9 weeks of launch. And that basically shows that, look, if you think DeFi is possible on Ethereum, here's a smart contract where people are earning like 10% in Bitcoin. That's pure Bitcoin transactions, right? So the Bitcoin appears in the wallet and it's growing, right? So why wouldn't a stable coin take off here? Like, people are building it. Like, already there are multiple developers who are building these things. So that's kind of like the thesis, which we're at the early stage of, like, we're seeing it play out. And let's say it takes off. Let's say Bitcoin really becomes kind of like the TCP/IP, right? And Stacks is the HTTP, or Clarity, or language is the JavaScript, right? And that's the technology stack. And there were other types of networks like before the internet as well, like AOL or other types of like ring networks and this and that, and they kind of like frizzled out. And eventually, everyone was using the internet. And if Bitcoin becomes that, although I think like it might not be that extreme in the blockchain world, right? Like, I think there might be a center of gravity that is Bitcoin, but there might be these other chains, and you can bridge to them, and there could be other functionality. The history doesn't repeat itself exactly, but I think it kind of rhymes. So we are in the camp that we want to be where the center of gravity is, and I think that's likely going to be Bitcoin. And what our work does for Bitcoin is actually pretty interesting. Like, if you think about how initially people were confused that will Bitcoin be used for buying coffee, or is this payments, or is this store of value? And over the last 3-4 years, it's very clear now that you're not going to buy coffee with Bitcoin, right? If the price is volatile,
Yeah.
you don't want to pay like $40 or $100 fee to buy a $5 cup of coffee, right? So Bitcoin
and then you have to pay tax, at least in the US. It's just,
exactly. Exactly, right? So Bitcoin actually becomes like a store of value, but interestingly, it is also a settlement layer. So the way I would be actually buying coffee through this network is there will be a stable coin on Stacks that is settling in Bitcoin, right? So the transactions are fast, it's stable. You paid like your $3 or $4 for coffee, and those transactions are settling in groups. Or same with Lightning Network, right? Like, it might be that you take the payment in a Lightning Network, and it's settling on Bitcoin. So Bitcoin becomes a settlement layer. But interestingly, the way that we have designed blockchain is that miners are actually bidding on the Bitcoin side, right? So they send Bitcoin transactions, and they are bidding for being selected as a miner for Stacks. So they see both Bitcoin and the Stacks chain, and those miners actually really value kind of like this function of being a miner on Stacks. So they're actually willing to pay very high Bitcoin fees, right? Because that the Stacks transactions are being packaged, like they are high value, like they pack a lot of information in that. Like, it might be stablecoin transactions, there might be other types of kind of like NFTs or whatever work that is getting packaged into a hash, and that is very valuable to them. So those miners are willing to pay $100 fee or $200 fee and so on the Bitcoin side. So this actually provides a path forward for Bitcoin, where you can be in a world where transaction fees are very high on the Bitcoin chain, yet there are parties that are willing to pay that fee because the information density of what they're packing in a single Bitcoin transaction is actually very high. Right? They're using it as a settlement layer versus using a pure Bitcoin transaction.
I see. And in a miner here, I guess in Blockstack, is that a miner in the same sense of a miner, on the Bitcoin consensus, or do they have a different profile, so to speak?
Yeah, so they are different, right? So usually people think of miners, they usually think they have hardware and they're doing some kind of like a ASIC, or maybe even like in Filecoin, you're storing kind of like data and you still have like, hardware for it, so on. So this is a pure software thing. Over here, the key insight is that it's like proof of work, right? So once you get Bitcoin through proof of work, now that Bitcoin actually represents that someone did computation, and it's a scarce resource, right? So we use Bitcoin um, in our consensus algorithm where people are bidding using Bitcoin, right? So it's a little bit like it's actually structured as um, a bidding optimization that anyone can come in and place these bids. So it's a permissionless, decentralized network. You could decide to be a miner, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to optimize your probability for being selected as a Stacks miner by bidding in Bitcoin. And you would only kind of like keep bidding higher if your expected return. There's basically a curve. At some point, you would stop bidding any higher, right? Because you don't think that the stacks that you're getting in return. So just like the Bitcoin network gives miners incentives by newly minted stacks and the fees, that you can get the new Bitcoin and you can get the fees. Similarly, the Stacks network is giving miners the incentive of the newly minted stacks, plus all the gas fees of smart contracts, so they can collect that. So they will basically do the calculation that you know I can actually make a profit by bidding X amount of Bitcoin. And interestingly, uh, mining has been very profitable on the network so far. Like I think there was an analysis that recently done that miners were actually making 108% profit on the network right now. So they're bidding Bitcoin, and then the stacks that they get, they maybe sell it for Bitcoin again to participate, and they're making a profit in the middle.
I see. And is the proof of work, is that similar to what like NEPA POWs are? If you're familiar with non-interactive proofs of work, I'm not too familiar with them, but I'm curious.
I
Uh,
haven't taken a deeper dive there.
okay, fair enough. I guess a more macro question on Bitcoin. So I guess, and I don't know if you agree with this, but assuming an infinite timeline, all Bitcoins are lost because right now we have this problem of lost coins. So I'm curious, one is your assumption that, super smart people are working on that problem today, it will eventually get solved, or is there a novel, or do you think that's wrong, or or is Blockstack working on sort of a novel solution there?
Yeah, so I think the supply of Bitcoin might decrease, but interestingly, I think it's a little bit like because you can like almost divide Bitcoin further, like in terms of like satoshis. There are 100 million satoshis in a Bitcoin, and I think look at the supply of Ethereum, right? It's roughly 100 million, although it's not exactly. Uh, and there are 100 million satoshis in a single Bitcoin, right? So in some ways, the network can function even if there are less quote unquote Bitcoin, because what really exists on the chain is UTXOs and satoshis, really. So I think if Bitcoin start getting lost, but Bitcoin is also extremely valuable, then the price adjustments would happen where maybe people are now talking in satoshis instead of Bitcoin. So that's one thing. I think what you're pointing out to touches upon a slightly different but relevant problem, where there is a point in time where new Bitcoins stop coming out, right? Or they're so small that right now most of the miners, they mine for the Bitcoin rewards. Mining fees are kind of like a nice to have, right? Like they're meaningful, but they're kind of like a nice to have. They're mostly going for the Coinbase reward, the newly minted Bitcoin. So as that keeps dropping, the revenue from the transaction fees needs to be significant for miners to keep operating the Bitcoin network. And as I mentioned, that especially if the Bitcoin price keeps appreciating, it actually disincentivizes a lot of people to use Bitcoin transactions. They would want to minimize their Bitcoin transactions as much as possible, right? And I think work that we have done with Stacks actually gives incentives for more transactions on the Bitcoin network with highly motivated actors who are willing to pay very high transaction fees. Because Stacks recently crossed like $2 billion in market cap. These miners are willing to pay extremely high fees to be a miner on the Stacks network, right? So I think Stacks actually helps Bitcoin in that sense that for the long-term time horizons, it has highly motivated parties who are willing to pay high transaction fees on the Bitcoin.
I see. That was going to be my next question. So I guess as more people use stacks, more quote unquote gas fees are being paid, which filters up to ultimately Bitcoin miner because they're collecting more fees. So the theory is
Yes,
that as more people use it, that nice to have component becomes a need to have, and it actually is adequate enough to compensate for the loss in the Coinbase
exactly.
rewards.
And I think there's a very interesting token economics detail there that's worth highlighting. So the way we design the token economics is uh, people who hold stacks. So there's a fundamental problem with gas tokens. Right? Like why, if all you want to do is use it as gas, then why wouldn't you just buy it when you need it, right? And that is sometimes against like how these blockchains are launched because uh, like initially, uh, basically there's more supply available because you can't kind of like do uh, kind of like the genesis block again and again, right? Like so in the beginning you can do these allocations, so maybe some people are actually buying up more of the supply early on because they're being investors and interestingly if there's no kind of like return on your gas token, there's less incentive to hold it. You're speculating at that point, right? Like because you're not holding it because you want to use it because you have more than enough tokens to use on the network. Interestingly, if your gas token has some sort of a yield, in our case, Stacks has a yield in Bitcoin, then there is actually incentive to hold it because you are earning that 10%, 15% yield in Bitcoin over there. So interestingly, not only we introduce the yield for a gas token to solve like that incentive problem, but that yield actually goes up the more smart contracts are being used on the network, right? So the yield is directly tied to the health of the network. If a lot of people are actually using the smart contracts, so right now you can go to this website called stacking.club and it shows the different yields and the amount of stacks locked and so on. But imagine that if a AMM, like automated market maker or a stablecoin is taking off on the smart contract side, the yield is actually going up. And so it's more profitable for miners and it's more profitable for kind of like the holders of the asset to see more traction on the network, which is a healthy network metric. Like everyone wants to see more traction on these decentralized applications and these smart contracts. But both miners and holders benefit when that happens. And I think that was a very important detail in our token economics.
That's super interesting. With the time that we have left, I'd like to switch. Well, I guess going back to you mentioned that you were looking at things that were broken with the internet, and I'm not quite sure exactly when you launched Stacks 1.0, but it was more of a focus on like storage and authentication. And so I guess were those two of the things that you saw that were broken with the internet? And why did you decide to launch like Stacks 1.0 with like those two solutions?
Yeah. So I think basically going back to the internet side of things is basically I feel like users should have their own direct username, like a global username on the internet. So let's say I registered Muneeb.id, which I have on Stacks, and it's not tied with any website, right? It's registered on the blockchain, and all the different applications built on top, like I actually authenticate into them using Muneeb.id, right? And that's like one core component. That instead of relying on Google or Facebook or something else, users get like a global username on the internet. And the second one is a private data drive. So almost imagine your home drive on the internet where you're hosting your data and apps are actually writing data with you, right? And it's like, let's say there's a photo sharing app and these things are built on top of the Stacks network where I'm sharing photos with you, but my photos are on my home drive and you have read access there. You can save a copy on your home drive, but there's no company in the middle that's kind of like hosting everything and you're reading it from the company, I'm reading it from the company and so on. So I think those were the fundamental things. And we interestingly, we shipped Stacks 1.0 partly because, and maybe that was not the right motivation, because like there was so much hype and kind of like uh, marketing and almost like teams that basically didn't have the technical depth to actually ship products and so on in 2017, that we really wanted to like, we've been working on this for years, right? Like this is a team of computer scientists from like Princeton and Stanford and so on. And we wanted to really differentiate ourselves from the rest of the projects, which were kind of like scammy and they were riding the hype and so on. And we basically said like, look, we'll ship kind of like the V1 within a year of our token offer, right? Which we did, like within a year, like the V1 network was out. In hindsight, like I think that was probably not the best decision, right? Because what happened was like that code base was in Python. It was a different code base. That network, we started working on the main network 2.0 like in parallel. So we started building the Clarity smart contract language. We started kind of like working on the Rust implementation, almost like on the side early on. But I think there was a 1 year of almost like a loss engineering cycle where that Python code base had to be thrown away, Stacks 1.0 had to be migrated over to 2.0, and maybe there's actually overhead in the migration. And in some ways, like even in market perception, I feel like we launched, but then developers were like, okay, let me try this thing. And then they're like, wait, there are no smart contracts here. Like it was limited, right? So it wasn't like they would compare it to things like Ethereum and like, hey, I can't even write a smart contract. So I think like it's potentially might have been a simpler world where we're like, okay, we raised capital. It takes 2-3 years to kind of like build the master design that we want to build, and we should just focus on building that. I think maybe we might have shaved off 6 to 9 months on our launch time, but you know
no,
that's all in the.
It's easy to say in hindsight. What was the best decision?
Exactly.
I guess quickly, and I'm apologies. This is like a naive question, but what is the difference between Gaia, Filecoin, and IPFS?
Yep, great question actually. So I think the way to think about this is IPFS is a peer-to-peer discovery mechanism for files that are addressed by content, right? So you would hash a file and you're looking for the hash, and IPFS helps you find where the content is. Right? And some people, but IPFS is not a permanent storage of files. You have to like seed this content. Think of I think it resembles more of the first generation peer-to-peer networks, like people who are familiar with BitTorrent or Napster and so on. Like different people are seeding content, but they don't really have an incentive to do it. If there's some incentive, in IPFS, there's even less incentive. Like people mostly seed their own content, and then content can also disappear from it. But it's a very nice kind of like look up this hash, and it's a very nice way to agree on the kind of like the semantics of a file and what the content address should look. And it's very popular in developers. Very easy to use. Juan was with me in Y Combinator when we went through Y Combinator together in the same batch, same group actually. And and I think he's done a great job in building a kind of like a content addressable network that developers really love, and they want to integrate it in their systems. But one takeaway would be it's not a permanent storage of files, and that's why he worked on Filecoin, whereas Filecoin has incentives for more permanent storage of files. Right? Like you're saying that I want to store my files and I need to pay for it, and here is I'm paying in Filecoin to a miner, and the miner has incentives to kind of like hold that data and so on. And it gets complicated, but it's a more decentralized way of the incentive structures for long-term file storage. And I think IPFS, in some ways, is missing the incentivization layer, and Filecoin provides it. So they're very much like complementary technology. And Gaia is something different, complementary in a way. Gaia is actually a wide area encrypted file system, right? It doesn't matter where the files are stored. They could be stored on Filecoin, they could be stored on a Dropbox or G Drive, anywhere else. What Gaia does is it helps users kind of like encrypt their data and then store it wherever they want to store it. Right? So it's actually a file system. And the difference with IPFS is content addressable, whereas Gaia is a normal file system structure, right? So you have folders and you have names of files, and there are pros and cons to both, right? Like if you're used to like going to someone's home drive and then /this/folder/this file, like you get that type of interface, but it's not content addressable. But interestingly, you can plug and play these things, right? Like for example, there's an IPFS driver for Gaia. You could actually theoretically have Gaia files that are uh, accessed through the Gaia file system actually be stored on a Filecoin network instead of being stored on Dropbox or G Drive and so on. I don't know
No,
if that
no
was super clear, but
that's certainly helpful. That's certainly helpful because I know that I should have clarified for our listeners, but Gaia is a solution built by Blockstack, correct? That you guys
yep.
employ, which I don't know if it was clear for our users, but no, that's certainly helpful. I guess you hear a lot of hype. I mean, around Filecoin today, of course, and so I have my own questions about talk about something that strikes me that should have been built on Bitcoin. Something like that strikes me, where it's like so essential as a storage. But anyway, that's probably I'm going on a tangent there. So you guys launched Stacks 2.0, which is the smart contract platform, in January, I believe. So I guess how's it gone so far?
No, it's great. I'm super excited with the launch. So I think of it this way that when the launch was happening, we also kind of like took a very confined path to all of this as well. We're the first project that got a SEC qualification for doing our offering of the tokens, and not only that we kind of like did the offering through the SEC qualification, we also worked on a legal framework for how you reach the point of decentralization, right? So before the launch, we released a legal memo which talks about securities regulations and how there are so many actors in our ecosystem now, and what role my company is not going to play on the network. So we were really like hands off in terms of like, okay, we did the R&D, we built the network, but really now we're done, and the miners are going to operate this network. We can't change the network anymore. And it was like a very explicit, comprehensive framework, and not kind of like really controlling the network, but pretending that as if it's decentralized and so on, right? So imagine launching something that's a new consensus algorithm, has new type of game theory. Yes, we have tested these things on testnet and whatnot, but now it's mainnet, and we don't control it anymore, right? So I think the stakes were really high, and then it was amazing to see miners actually come in and respond to the game theory and the incentives and actually run the network. And I think I don't want to misquote, but I believe something like $10 million in Bitcoin has transferred, or maybe more, through our mining. People are earning rewards. Like I mentioned, the kind of like capital getting locked up to earn these Bitcoin rewards. So that's working out. And then the thing I'm most excited about is actually what developers are doing, right? So they're discovering clarity. Like interestingly, like so I think we do come from a more kind of like careful school of thought. Like the reason why we did the SEC qualified offering is so that I can sleep at night in peace. That hey, I'm not gonna
Yeah.
wake up with kind of like federal prosecutors knocking on my doors, which was a fear in 2017 that a lot of people were like maybe that would never happen. But later on, like with what happened with Telegram or Ripple and other cases, that became a reality. Like same with smart contract security and bugs. There is $500 million of capital locked up in this POX contract, but I can sleep a little bit easier at night because we know that the programming language is clarity, and it's a decidable language, and we can have formal verification. It is basically just optimized for security, versus something else that is Turing complete or has other types of complexity in it, where it's much harder to get that type of guarantees that something is not going to go wrong with the contract, right? So I think our years of hard work is actually in a way paying off now, right? Where the developers were also experiencing this, they go like, oh wow, so you've designed clarity in a way like they feel that it's very thoughtful, it's very elegant, and they love the fact that they actually, I think the superpower here really is the interaction with Bitcoin, right? So you can actually build a lending application where Bitcoin actually stays on the Bitcoin chain, right? You have the clarity logic that can interact with it. So now imagine Bitcoin lending in a fully decentralized way, right? Where you never have to move your Bitcoin from the Bitcoin chain. And then similarly, like other types of interesting things you can do with the Bitcoin capital that's available, and how you can deploy it into smart contracts and so on. So I think they feel the power of it, and they're responding. They're building all sorts of amazing things. And I think that's we're kind of like riding the high of that right
Yeah.
now.
No, I'm sure. So I mean, I'm sure like, those worries and concerns have subsided a bit, but I'm sure new ones have propped up. And I guess like what do you see now, now that you've released the smart contract platform? It's so far it's held up. Miners have participated in all those things. What do you see as the next like sort of challenge? Is it what you're focusing on right now at Hero where you're building developer tooling? Because a lot of other blockchains launch and then there's no way to query the database. There's no way to run a full node, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So is that um, what you see
Yep.
as like sort of the next hurdle?
Yeah. So I think there are two things here, right? So one I would say is developer. Like in the end, developers are going to go where they enjoy the tooling, and they even if they look under the hood, they really like the elegance of the engineering design and so on. So I think Hero, the company, is like developer focus. It's great to have that single focus. Like we now only need to talk to developers. Right? If we write a blog post, we can be as technical as we want to be, right? And that's in many ways very liberating. So
Yeah.
Hero has this focus, and then there are other entities that are looking at community and mining or user-facing clients or mobile wallets. There are 6, 7 independent entities in our ecosystem now, which trade other than the applications that are kind of built on top. And so for my company, it's like developers, and I think eventually, like 3, 4 years from now, the winning platform will be the one where most of the developers are. Right? Like that's really really going to be it. So we're happy focusing there. I do think there's a second thing going on, which is about broader crypto education and even onboarding a lot of developers. Like I think a lot of people they discover crypto through Bitcoin, and then they discover that hey, you can't program Bitcoin, and then they discover Ethereum or some other blockchain, and they try to like play around with it that way. So I think there's a huge opportunity, mostly on the education side or on programming bootcamp side, where we can really take the lead in educating people to hey, this is Bitcoin, and by the way, here's how you program Bitcoin. And here's why you want to do it in a decidable language like clarity versus something else, right? So I think we really want to take this approach of look, but the bulk of the developers have never written a smart contract right now, right? I think 99% of the developers have never written a smart contract. So let's focus on educating them. Let's focus on describing these differences to them. That what are the trade-offs you're making if you're building on this platform versus that platform. And I think that is something that maybe my past academic training would kick in, and I definitely enjoyed that type of work as well.
No, that makes sense. I guess if you're a developer and you're wondering, what should I build today? What are the type of things that you think in the immediate term, like what we call at DLab, we call these things first order problems or hair on fire
Mhm.
problems. Like, a lot of companies that we see are really third order problems, like nice to haves, maybe necessary in 5 years. But what would you say are some first order type startups that a developer could build on Blockstack today?
Yeah, I would say that I actually have started blogging again recently. So set up a website on Muneeb.com, and I one of the themes is that I want to talk about these applications that should be built. So I recently had a tweet storm about a Bitcoin lending application where I think a lot of Bitcoiners they basically they don't want to sell their Bitcoin, right? They don't even want to convert it to like wrapped BTC because they get a tax hit, and they don't trust kind of like the tech stack on Ethereum or some other places. So the holy grail of a Bitcoin lending application, same with companies like BlockFi are doing a great job, but Bitcoiners usually hedge. Right? They would be like, I'll put like 3% of my Bitcoin there or 5% of my Bitcoin in case like something goes wrong because they're custodial and they have their own risk models and
Yeah,
and so
I
on.
guess what I would say to that, like, it's nice, but like, the yield on BlockFi is like 3%. And then, I have it at my exchange and, then I'm looking at the disclaimers and it's two set of disclaimers and it's like 6 pages of text. And I'm like, so anyway, sorry.
Yep, exactly, right? So the holy grail of a Bitcoin lending application is where you have Bitcoin, you send it to another Bitcoin address to lend, and you either get your Bitcoin back plus interest, or there's collateral, automatic collateral, that if the Bitcoin doesn't come back, the collateral automatically, there's a smart contract that releases the collateral to you. And the collateral could be 200% or 300%, whatever you want. So that if someone runs away with your Bitcoin, you just go and buy more Bitcoin. And that is possible, literally possible today. There's no new tooling needed. Whatever we launched today, you can go and build this. And I sketched it out in like TweetStorm recently, but I'll write a more detailed, like here's the architecture of that application. And you can go and build it. That will definitely be, I think, one of them. I mentioned that people are already building kind of like these almost like stable coins on Bitcoin, right? So imagine stable coins on Bitcoin, or maybe even exchanges where all the trading pairs are in Bitcoin. So you get the Bitcoin capital to trade against stable coins on smart contracts on top of Bitcoin. I think that's where some of the synergy of the Bitcoin capital really starts to make sense, because it's $1 trillion of capital. Most of it is actually sitting passive, right? Like this is not actively deployed capital. And I think that's really the next stage of Bitcoin, where some of this passive Bitcoin capital will start getting turned into active capital, and people will be earning yields on it or directly trading it in easier ways and so on. So I think like those types of applications are really kind of like ripe for development right now.
Yeah, no, that from a user, I think that just would provide anything that provides a much similar user experience than one that currently exists would be great. Do you guys have a grant program or anything like that where you're potentially giving funding, whether it's equity, you're taking equity or grant free to these developers or people want to build things?
Yeah, so there's a Stacks Foundation. It's a nonprofit in our ecosystem, and the Stacks Foundation has a grants program. And I think they've already given like a bunch of grants, and they have resources, right? Like they have a 100 million Stacks treasury that at today's prices would be worth like close to $200 million. So they are exclusively focused on developers and community and so on. So Hero is a company, and obviously we're building developer tools. But there are entities like the Stacks Foundation in our ecosystem that give out grants to developers and so on.
And what's the best way? Is it like just pop into the Discord or?
Yeah, I think just if people can just go to stacks.org, and they have a grants section right there, and with all the details.
Great. I guess the last question I have is, how can we be helpful to you? You know, to the people listening, general community. How can we be helpful?
Yes, I think I would say that it's surprising how most people don't even realize that smart contracts can happen on Bitcoin. Like there's like this almost like information gap where somebody would say, "Oh, I'm just gonna I'll have something like, you know, let's just build this on top of Bitcoin," and people will be like, "You can't do it. Bitcoin is like a dumb rock." Right. So
Right.
there's this perception problem that that I think people can really help with, that help educate their friends, help educate others, or maybe even yourself. Like try to take a deeper look that smart contracts for Bitcoin, not only that they're possible, they're already here, and you can build them like today, and you can deploy them today, right? And I think that message is worth kind of like spreading, especially in the Bitcoin circle. And I think right now, I wouldn't be surprised if like more than 95% of the Bitcoiners actually don't realize that smart contracts for Bitcoin are not theoretical. They're already here. They can start using them pretty soon.